Hi there, and welcome to the new video here on my channel about dating guys with Asperger syndrome. So I figured I'd make a quick video about the topic of empathy, simply because I feel there's still a lot of confusion around it whenever neurotypical people interact with people on the autism spectrum. I think the most important thing to remember is that people with Asperger syndrome tend to have a lot of empathy. They might not be easily able to recognize how you feel, but if they know, for example, that you feel sad, then they feel sad with you, and especially if they've gone through a similar situation themselves. Not just people, but also animals. And I found it interesting online. People report they cry to commercials. They feel very much with fictional characters, even like sometimes stuffed animals or inanimate objects. So understandably, people with Asperger syndrome get very upset when neurotypical people say they feel, Aspies just don't have empathy, or they don't have, emotions or whatever. They have a lot of empathy and emotions. But they have a really hard time, putting themselves in other people's shoes. And there's such a thing called, theory of mind, where a person can, realizes that other people have their own minds, have their own emotions. And sometimes you read online or see online that people with Asperger's or on the autism spectrum don't have that theory of mind. Now with Asperger's especially I disagree with that. Of course people know, and they might learn it slightly later than neurotypicals, but they do know that other people have their own mind, their own feelings. It's just about tapping into that. A lot what we do automatically as neurotypicals. People with Asperger syndrome have to do consciously. As a neurotypical, you can glance at the person, you can have an idea if that person is happy to see you or not. You could even, like in traffic, you could glance at the person in another car, and you could almost, often get an initial read of what's going on, in what emotional state they're in, roughly. Now, a person with Asperger syndrome is often completely blind to that, and doesn't have that thing where our brains kind of process, analyze and interpret what we see, and then we just get the sensation, without having to think about it. A person with Asperger's has to actually look, okay, what are the facial expressions, what's the tone of voice, what's that person saying, what's going on with the situation. And it's almost like, I feel it's like an FBI profiler, has to put all the evidence on the board and go like, okay, what could that person's emotional state be? And then interpret, and at that point, maybe they can react to it. So obviously that's a lot of effort. They might not even know they have to do it, as they're busy with something else, and you're there, had a bad day or was sad or whatever. So that's why sometimes it feels like Aspies are slow on the uptake with everything. They can't interpret situations, and sometimes they react way too late, etc. So that's simply because they have to do that consciously. I found interesting when I read that some Aspies then tend to focus so much on learning all that, and they get so good at intellectual analysis of body language, facial expressions, etc., that they might even become psychoanalysts or psychologists. You think it's kind of counterintuitive on Aspie to take on that job, but because they make that their conscious effort all the time, they get really good at it. Whereas a typical person might even not really know why they get a certain impression of a person's emotional state. But some Aspies are super interested in what makes people tick, and so then they might actually get really good at reading people. But most Aspies, especially male Aspies, they have their special interests, and they just from when they're a baby or a toddler, they just don't go through as many social situations. They're not as perceptive with emotions. I think one thing that plays into this whole empathy thing is that people with Asperger's often just have this very thin emotional lexicon, where, like us neurotypical people, we constantly interpret social situations and learn, cause and effect and all of that. And from when we are a toddler and doing the social play up to through school to now. So I can imagine, I'm probably have been thousands of times in a situation where I was envious of somebody else consciously, and kind of realized that. And the person with Asperger's might have only been a handful of times be envious and realize that they're envious. So so I think that definitely plays into it, that and Aspies report that as well. They say, sometimes I feel stuff and it takes me a long time to figure out what I'm feeling, to put a label on it. Am I aggravated, embarrassed, whatever? So even their own emotions, they have to consciously sort out what they're feeling. So I think it's very understandable if you even take some time to sort out your own feelings, how much harder than it is to sort out if somebody else is embarrassed, aggravated, or whatever, just going by their external clues. And of course that's even harder if you can't easily empathize, because that person might be doing something that you just simply would never do. And that's my experience with dating guys with Asperger's, because very often you have these situations where I'm, as a woman, I have completely different take on a lot of things, just simply through gender differences. And so they have a hard time putting themselves into my shoes when they really kind of need to do this to get this dating going, or to get on one page with me. Definitely. Let's say a non-dating situation. Let's say a girl, let's say an Aspie studying at university, and some girl says, "Oh, I'm so I flunked this test," and she's really devastated, but by her face and everything, but he cannot put himself into her shoes because, he might not flunk tests, or he feels, hasn't had recent experience with academic failure or whatever. So he might start lecturing her, what, didn't you say that you went on spring break and, just partied a lot there, maybe next time, if your grades are slipping, you can study more or whatever. So Aspies can be extremely, when they're not empathetic, because they can't really put themselves into your shoes, then they might say something where they try to solve the situation, or they address your flaws, and they can't empathize with you because they wouldn't do what you do, and so because they think what you're doing is wrong, so they start telling you what is wrong. And of course it's that drives people away really quickly, because people connect through emotions, through shared emotions, or recognizing other people's emotions. They don't connect through giving advice as much, or trivia, or exchanging information. It's all this emotional state, reading emotional states, getting on the same page emotionally, and that's just really hard for Aspies. So I figured, as usual, I tried to give some examples from my own life, and I really started, thinking about, okay, what were situations where I went whoa, my date or partner just can't read at all my my emotional state or where I might be coming from, and then that can be very jarring for a neurotypical person, because we like automatically, when we talk with somebody, we try to at least somewhat see their position, and especially when you date and you really want to have that togetherness and harmony. So several examples came to mind. One was like I was telling, and we had been actually dating for a while, and I was telling this guy about how my son, when he reached like high school age, he wanted to spend more time with his dad. So he decided to move in, move out from my place and move in with his dad. And no, I was not really emotional when I was telling that tidbit from my life, but it was a difficult situation back then. Of course, it's difficult for mom, and even from maybe wasn't like really expressive emotionally when I told the story. I would have guessed that a neurotypical person would have picked up on the fact that it was a bit difficult thing in my life. Anyway, so he said. My date said then something along the lines of, yeah, you know what? I was wondering why he wasn't living with you. Usually that's a sign of that there's drugs involved or such. It was I just felt like such an insensitive thing to say. Yeah, it's a little bit unusual if a kid doesn't live with a mother, but then to say like, if that happens, then there's usually drugs involved or whatever. It was just so insensitive, where like any halfway reasonable person would have said, oh, this must have been so difficult for you or whatever. So that was one thing where clearly this 50-something never married bachelor with no kids really had never been in a situation how that might feel, how when a kid moves out or something like that. So he had really no reference points, no background where he could connect with that. So he just said something fairly insensitive. Then there was another situation with a different guy who, like an Aspies style, was pretty direct, and even about a topic which is a bit more sensitive usually, which is that he just didn't have a very high sexual desire level, or not super passionate all the time, but struggling with that. He was again, maybe not so as super physical as other guys, like people with Asperger sometimes are. And he even like early on, like he asked me one time, like fairly blunt, okay, if we were living together, how often would we have sex? And it was almost like I could tell that it was like he was hoping it wasn't too often. It's just a weird situation, but Aspies are often kind of blunt, and they don't, again, empathize how it might come across, and then you kind of. But anyway, so he was telling me about his ex, who was like more the Latin, passionate, very very attractive woman, and he complained how just out of the blue, like she started to just act really irrationally sometime into their relationship, where she just got wildly jealous all the time, and then in the end even cheated on him and stuff like that. So usually I don't comment on people's past relationship or whatever, but at that point I felt like almost like I pointed out that as women, if we don't feel very desired by our guy, that can make us feel, very, unattractive or unsexy, and just indicating that this can be difficult for a woman. And and he looked at me and he was like thinking, yeah, I never looked at it that way. And again, that was like, when he said that, it struck me as so strange that somebody might have never really thought about how it might feel from a woman's perspective, if a guy is not very passionate and doesn't want her very often. Again, just a thing where probably an Aspie guy has a hard time putting himself into the shoes of a woman, and women are more things revolve around that we want to feel attractive and desired and stuff like that. So even though certainly both genders do, but yeah, so that was certainly one example. Third example of lacking empathy. And you might notice, empathy is just feeling, and I think the word comes from feeling into, like from Greek, and we even in German we have like einfühlen, Mitgefühl. You feel into, or you feel in tune with somebody, or you feel with somebody. And that feeling doesn't have to be like just sadness or compassion that you feel for somebody who's going through a rough time, but just in general feeling the other person's emotional state. Third example, so I was dating this guy, and he was quite a bit older than me, like 12 years, and we both had like kind of corporate jobs, and he hated he didn't hate it, but he didn't really like his job. It was like intellectually really below him, and he was kind of bored, and he was counting down the days to his early retirement, because his job did have the advantage of this full health insurance as soon as you retire early, and he had accrued a lot of vacation, so he was really counting down to the point when he could retire from that job. So sometime in our relationship he said, and he said it with like a beaming face, like really happy, he said, yeah, that'll be so great. When I retire, I can for a few years, I can travel for 6 months out of the year, and you can continue working, and you're filling up your 401k, and then after a few years, then you can retire, and then we can travel together. And he said it was the best plan ever, and I just thought how weird that was, that this guy was just not even thinking twice about, okay, would a woman want to be with a man who's traveling 6 months out of the year, and then she's just his home base to relax between traveling, and 6 months out of the year she'd wake up alone and have nobody, and so that was really weird to, it's okay to have that plan, but again, Aspies sometimes, then they don't think to think it through from the other person's perspective, and then maybe put it a little bit in context. Definitely, that's very, very difficult, to read other people, or to walk in their shoes as an Aspie when you have trouble with that in everyday life and in imagining situations, and but it's that often leads to these situations where suddenly you realize, okay, that empathy is missing. I think that's why then Aspies sometimes get that reputation that they don't even consider other people's feelings, have no empathy or whatever. But it's just simply, it's very, very difficult for them to put themselves into other people's shoes. And in fact, if I wanted to test if somebody is a person with Asperger's, I would almost, I think, just imagining, I think it would be a good, how you would find out, in my opinion, would be to give them a social situation that they are not prepared for, and then just ask them what they would do then. Let's say ask them, okay, if we were to go blind in a couple months, how would you react? What would you do? And a lot of us neurotypicals would then kind of we would be able to imagine ourselves in a situation and maybe the emotions that would come with it, and then we could speak from that. Whereas a person with Asperger's would have a really hard time imagining themselves in an imaginary situation and imagining what kind of feelings they might have in this hypothetical situation. So they might talk about how they would redesign their place to make it disability friendly for people that are blind, but he would not be able to possibly talk as much about, wanting to travel, wanting to see some things, something like that. Or that famous question of like what person, living or dead, from history would you want to have dinner with? And actually I discussed this with one Aspie. He said something like it horrified me. I think he said like Hitler or Stalin or something like that. And it was like, oh yeah, those are the, it's like one of the most fascinating, interesting people of the 20th century. And of course, as a neurotypical person, you're thinking dinner with somebody, you're thinking more of that emotional connection, that conversation that could ensue, whereas the Aspie maybe would more think like, okay, just maybe somebody related to their special interest that they could exchange information, or maybe they say something like Hitler or Stalin, just thinking that it would be out of intellectual curiosity to meet these people. But then if you ask the follow-up question, so yeah, what would you actually talk about with them, and how would you feel about sitting there with Hitler? There would probably be nothing forthcoming, because they can't imagine themselves in the social situation, what they might feel, how the conversation would play out. Yeah, so empathy. Feeling with other people with those larger emotions like sadness, grief, anger, but also the small emotions. And I think that's like, whereas for neurotypical people, I feel the most important thing for them to understand is that people with Asperger syndrome have a lot of emotions. And they often report having this rush of emotions that they have to sort out that can be overwhelming, and then they might just break down in tears. And so they have a lot of emotions and compassion for others, but a hard time realizing that in the other person, or recognizing emotion. And then for the neurotypical person, or for the Aspie, I think it's important to understand how important that is for neurotypical people to feel that empathy, not just with the large stuff, not just, oh, I had this bad day, I need a hug, I need comfort, but also with all those little emotions. So, even like we love, of course, small talk. That's one of the things that just Aspies hate, because to them, conversation or talking is a lot information exchange, and they don't have this attitude that we have as neurotypicals, where we love recognizing shared emotions and then expressing them, just like, okay, we're feeling the same thing. Oh, look at this beautiful sunset, looking at it together. And the Aspies feels like, well, I see there's a sunset, what information is being told there, but it's just all about shared emotions. Or like Monday morning in the elevator, back to the grind. One person might joke a little, and that's not gay because it's so funny, or because it's not, but it's just simply recognizing that we're all feeling the same thing, back to the grind, and somebody saying it in this shared emotional state that's recognized. That's very satisfying. Similarly, like, and it can, to an Aspie, probably it looks inane or like really stupid that, let's say at a company party and the buffet opens and people get their plates, and you find yourself next to the coworker there, and you're looking at the food, and you go like, wow, choices, so much food, it's kind of neither super funny nor information, valuable information. Everybody sees there's a lot of food, but it's a shared emotional state, that empathy, that we're admiring the amount of food. That's an emotion. It's not an important emotion, but it's nice to kind of share it. Or it's really weird. But and that must be so tough, because it is so hard for a person with Asperger's, even to recognize an emotion, and then find something to say about it or how to express it. But I think it's so important, and the one good thing about all this is, and this channel is about dating too, it's that once you understand that, and once you focus on that, recognizing other people's emotions, recognizing shared emotions, you can forget a lot of the other stuff. Like, I think Aspies, when it comes to flirting, for example, they feel like, I need the smartest pickup line. I need to pay a compliment. All right, let me think of a compliment. All right, what if she just says thanks or whatever? I can't tell if she liked the compliment. Maybe I need to pay her another compliment. Maybe I need to find a better pickup line. Just something good to say to her. And it's really all this not important. It's not a good approach. The best approach really is if you find yourself in a shared situation with another person, or a girl or woman, then to recognize it. And you can even just make this observation. It can be like, let's say you go to a meetup event, with a group at a brewery, and then you find yourself, next to a girl you're interested in, and you're looking at the beer selection menu, and she's looking as well. So there's that shared emotional state of looking at beers and trying to figure out what you want, and then even just to say something like, I wonder what key lemon lime beer tastes like, or something like that. And that might be exactly what she's thinking too. So by voicing that out loud, having empathy for that agonizing choice of deciding which beer to pick and what they might taste like, you created this moment together. And what I like about this is that there's absolutely no pressure on her. If you had told her something, or asked a question, or paid her a compliment, or use a pickup line, she would have been forced to respond. But by simply, not even looking at her, just making an observation, and it's just an emotion that you're both feeling, you just opened the door to a conversation, and then she can respond if she likes and continue. And she knew if she wanted to talk with you before you even said anything. What you say to her is not what seduces the woman to start a conversation with you. It's just that icebreaker to start talking, and talking, that togetherness through shared feeling is just a great way to do that. And yet another thing I like about this is that, especially for Aspies, it avoids just a lot of common mistakes that Aspies make, which is, they tend to be so caught in their own perspective, and then they want to use their intelligence or their knowledge or their power of analysis to help or connect with the other person. And you just simply can't do this if you start with, okay, what's the other person feeling, and then expressing that emotion, expressing empathy for that. Let's say a different situation, a girl says, oh, I failed this test. You think, okay, maybe you can read it on her face in body language, or maybe you can just imagine how she's feeling, and then you go like, oh, this must be so devastating for you. You avoid what some others Aspies might say instead, which is, oh, you failed a test, oh, let me give you this great system that I have for preparing for tests or whatever, which is the exactly wrong thing to say. So by having empathy, talking from the other person's perspective, you avoid any kind of lecturing or telling other people something, and you create a more emotional bond. So empathy, really, really difficult, but really, really rewarding. That's just how neurotypicals interact, and that's all the time with everything. It's even a business environment. Let's see, a project manager might say, we really need this done by the end of the month. And an Aspie might say, just no way we can do it. We have to refactor the database schema, and then we have to rewrite the whole business layer, and it's just not possible. So without empathy for what the project manager might be feeling, whereas a neurotypical person might start more like, I know the sales department really, really needs this application by the end of the quarter. However, with our current plans, it would be like really impossible to pull off. So let's see if we can look at some alternatives. So you start off with this empathy that this project manager, he's not dictating or anything. He's getting a lot of pressure from above, from the stakeholders, that they want that application done. So if you recognize that and then take it from there, it's then always it helps with everything. So so those are the two main points. First of all, yes, people with Asperger's have a lot of empathy once they know the situation and can read emotion, or know the emotion, and can recognize it. And then for neurotypical people, for people with Asperger's, the important thing is really it pays off big time to simply accept that this is how neurotypical people like to connect personally. So work on empathy, try to get better and better at recognizing social situations, reading expressions, and then commenting on that, and not shutting down, not saying, oh, I'm just not good at this stuff, I'm just, I won't even try. And I think in some relationships, Aspies say like, well, whatever you feel, just tell me, just whenever you feel bad, you have to say, hey, I've had a bad day, I feel really sad, I need a hug, and then the Aspie person can react, and they don't have to read the typical person. But I'm not a huge fan of this, because there's something extremely rewarding for a neurotypical person, when others spontaneously recognize feelings and connect that way. And with this, I think I'll wrap it up here, and I can't think of something else. It's a very broad topic, but well, one thing maybe to point out is, because some neurotypical people might be watching this and go like, well, I know this one Aspie guy, and he doesn't give a crap about anything. He doesn't care about people's emotion. I could tell him how I feel, and he still wouldn't care. And I've met people like that. I've been even on like a first date with them. Of course I wouldn't like go on a second date or whatever, but I think what can easily happen is that, just imagine yourself in the situation. You can't read people. You get it wrong all the time. People accuse you of being cold-hearted. Every morning you wake up and you go like, okay, whom am I gonna accidentally insult today? Who am I gonna make? Who am I gonna make cry today by something I say, just simply because I can't read their facial expression and stuff? And I think that every Aspie uses different coping mechanisms. Like some Aspies become really quiet and hardly ever say something, and Then some Aspies, I think they just decide that they're just cold-hearted. They just don't care about people's feelings, and they just shut off, build that wall, and just are done with it, rather going through the constant struggle of wanting to blend in, wanting to make other people feel good, and then constantly failing. I think it's similar to, as a neurotypical person, imagine if people constantly told you you're dumb, and you then find yourself also doing dumb things all the time. At some point you might simply decide, well, I'm dumb, so maybe the similar that would be in metaphor or analog situation for where a person with Asperger's who constantly gets told that he's cold-hearted and doesn't have empathy and doesn't have feelings, it is just a robot at the end, might just take that on and be unfeeling. And I've had definitely like men in their 50s or whatever who just say, I don't care, I've grown cold-hearted over the years, and then you find out that they dote on their 3 rescue cats or whatever, and you go like, well, this guy really does have feelings and empathy and everything. It's just he's kind of shut himself off for some reason. So that's important to remember, how difficult that is for a person with Asperger's, and traumatic, from being a little kid, not fitting in, and accidentally hurting other kids with things you say. Empathy, very, very important skill. And hopefully some of my other videos help a little bit more with actually getting better, or some tips and hints how to react in a better emotional shared state to neurotypicals, rather than in a more Aspie, no nonsense, just the facts ma'am way. Alright, and with this I'm going to wrap this up here. Hope some of this was helpful, and I look forward to talking with you again really soon. Bye.